When you look at a map of Japan, you probably think that Yokohama is part of Tokyo. However, it's actually Japan's second largest city, and it's also the home of the CP Plus photo exhibition, which is going on at the moment. And you may well have seen some of the news that's coming out from some statements by a Nikon executive about the launch later this year of a consumer level mirrorless camera. So let's have a think about what that might just look like. As I picked up on in my previous video around the tipping point between DSLR and mirrorless, there's been a lot of activity in 2018 from all of the manufacturers around launches, upgrades of their mirrorless ranges. Nikon has been in the middle of that with the launch of their Z series cameras, the Z7 and the Z6. This announcement by a Nikon executive of a consumer level Z series camera later this year is an interesting one because it further extends the range of cameras that Nikon has in that space. So where will Nikon pitch their consumer level Z series camera? Nothing that I say in this video has any basis in fact that I've heard from Nikon. It's merely my hypotheses, my ideas of where Nikon may pitch what I'm assuming will be the Z5. No one's even named it the Z5 yet, so we're all assuming that it will be a Z5 based on the fact that the Z6 and the Z7 sit in their respective spaces. The challenge that Nikon has is that their mirrorless range, the Z range, the Z series, are a whole new range of cameras. They're not replacing like for like, and therefore what they've got to try and do is balance what they're offering to the market versus what's in their existing ranges. They don't want to cannibalize their DSLR ranges, but equally they've got to give some wow factor. They've got to put something there that will convince people that they need to change. They need to transition from perhaps a DSLR across to a mirrorless camera. Equally, they've already put a stake in the ground with the Z7 and the Z6. So they've got to balance it with those cameras already in the range. It's undoubtedly a real challenge for them, but one they've spent a lot of time thinking about how they achieve that. So let's have a think about the Z5, or what we're assuming is the Z5. So let's try and put ourselves in the shoes of those Nikon executives in those product meetings, trying to work out what are they going to bring to market in their Z5. They've already kind of positioned the Z7 as a comparable to the D850. They've positioned the Z6 as a comparable to the D750. If we try and map across from perhaps where the Z5 will be, is it possibly marrying across to the D7500? Or does it marry across to the D610 as it was? If we're looking at those cameras, then we've got a bit of a starting point for people's aspirations and where Nikon will have to pitch it in the market. If we start by looking at the body, it's likely that the body of the Z5 will be the same in form as the bodies of the Z6 and Z7. There's a lot of opportunity here for Nikon to create consistency across their range, which has benefits in terms of marketing. It also has benefits in terms of production and scale. So if the body is a similar form to the Z6 and Z7, there is one question though: will they go with the carbon fibre composite monocoque structure of the D7500, or will they stick with a magnesium alloy based body as with the Z6 and Z7? Could go either way. Interesting though, I think they will stick with the weather sealing from the Z6 and Z7. It's been well received in the market. It's a bit of a USP for Nikon of having a robust body that's weather sealed. And most likely, looking at the route map for lenses, the most obvious kit lens is going to be the 24-70 that you can get with the Z6 and Z7, which is also weather sealed. So why not take advantage of that? If you're keeping the same size body as the Z6 and Z7, which makes so much sense, it's likely the Z5 will retain the same battery, the EN-EL15B. Again, this creates scale for Nikon. It starts to consolidate the range and make it quite consistent. Whilst we're considering the potential body for the Z5, This brings us on to one of the potential departures from something like the D7500, in that the D7500 has a built-in flash, whereas the Z6 and Z7 don't. That's partly because they're aimed at a more professional market, but it's also in that helps with the weather sealing of the camera. So I would suggest that the Z5 will probably not have a built-in flash. It's an interesting departure, but it's one that now, with the quality of the sensors, with the noise levels or the low noise levels that you get at high ISOs, it's making the need for a built-in flash on a consumer level camera less important. Equally, if people are using this for video as well as photography, there's less of a need for a traditional flash and more of a need for continuous lighting, which can be done with off-the-shelf, fairly reasonably priced lights that you can buy these days. So moving away from a flash may be acceptable to the market in the world we live in today. In my previous video, where I looked at my journey from a DSLR, a D850, to adding a Z7 to that, I considered the form factor and the buttons on the Z7 compared to the D850, and there have been some tweaks, but it probably pitches the form factor and the positioning of all the buttons on the Z series somewhere in between the D850 and the D7500. So you've got some user programmable settings on the dial, but you've kept the flexibility and the customization of a lot of the different buttons. And we'll probably see that on the Z5. We may see that the LCD on the top of the camera that you get on the Z6 and Z7 may disappear on the Z5 as a bit of a differentiator. We'll also see that on the back screen, I think we'll probably see the same flip out screen, because I think people are used to that. But we may see that whereas on the Z6 and 7 I think it's about a 2 million pixel screen, on the Z5 it may be just a 1 million pixel screen. So a slight differentiator there. But it will remain touchscreen, because I think that's where the market expects it to be, and where other cameras that the Z5 will be competing with are also. So that covers most of the more external parts of the Z5. If we now think about some of the inner workings of the Z5, and we start with the memory cards, that challenge that was so divisive on the Z6 and Z7, it's likely we'll still see a single card slot on the Z5. There's no reason that Nikon would put dual card slots on the Z5 whilst leaving a single card slot on the Z6 and Z7. We may be surprised, but I think it unlikely. It's possible though that we won't see the XQD in the Z5. We'll see the SD card, far more consumer level card. It'll allow people to perhaps transition from their current cameras where they have SD cards across into the Nikon range. In relation to the EVF, it's possible we might see a slightly lower resolution EVF, or we may see the same really high quality EVF that we see in the Z6 and Z7. At the heart of all these cameras is the sensor, and this is an interesting one because the Z6 has a 24.5 megapixel sensor, and it's possible that Nikon may keep that sensor, or they may introduce a new sensor at around the 20-21 megapixel level. I think where there will be a difference is that whilst on the Z6 you've got about 279 focus points, I think we'll probably see that come down on the Z5 to around about the 150 odd sensor points. Interestingly, the D7500 has around about 50 sensor points, so a 150 level would probably be a step up whilst not encroaching on the Z6 functionality. We will of course see some of the uplifts that we're going to see in the firmware later in the year on the Z6 and 7 probably flowing down onto the Z5, so you'll have face recognition or face detection and eye detection. Whether we'll see in-body stabilization is another point. It may be an area of differentiation where we see the Z5 not having the in-body stabilization but relying on software-based vibration reduction. To ensure the differentiation between the Z5 and the Z6 and that balance between the Z5 and the D7500, it's likely that we'll see some functionality throttling in a number of areas with the Z5. It's possible that the ISO range will be between 100 and 51-200, similar to the Z6. It's possible that we'll see the continuous focusing limited to perhaps between 5 and 8 frames per second. And in relation to video shooting capabilities, whilst it would be possible for Nikon to cap the capabilities at 1080p, perhaps 60 frames per second, I think it's highly likely we'll see 4K capability coming in. We're talking about a camera that's probably going to be revealed around July this year, 2019, and then made available around August, September 2019 in order to catch the Christmas market. Therefore, what are other manufacturers going to be offering? What's the market expectation of a camera at this level in about 6 to 9 months' time? I think 4K video will increasingly be important, and therefore it's likely we'll see 4K capability at up to about 30 frames per second. We may also see slow motion at 1080p, perhaps up to 60 frames per second, perhaps capped a little bit lower than the 120 frames per second in the Z6 and Z7. One thing's for sure, Nikon will be marketing this camera on its video credentials, and therefore we won't see them holding it back too much compared to what Canon has perhaps done with the EOS RP. So I think it gives Nikon a really great opportunity. So what do you think Nikon will put into their Z5 camera? Leave your ideas in the comments below. There's one thing for sure, 2019 is looking like being a really interesting year from a mirrorless camera perspective. So let's see if we can predict what's going to come out when Nikon release their Z5.